All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are live again here on LinkedIn, and we will now begin the panel discussion. Uh, this panel discussion is about how to go global with AI. And we have amazing panelists, Natalie Pioco, APAC CTO Strategic Advisory at Google Cloud with significant Silicon Valley and AI experience. Thanks for joining us. Our very own Dr. Catriona Wallace, uh, chairperson of Boab AI and CEO of Ethical AI, and the first female to launch an AI company on the ASX. Online, we got Jeremy Howard, a serial entrepreneur who created Fast Mail, Kaggle, and more recently Fast AI, which has millions of users around the world.
And most importantly, winner of the inaugural Boab debate, my number one
Winner.
credential.
Complete winner.
Thank you for mentioning. I guess we already know that. Um, Also, Jeremy Cooper, global CMO at Clear Dynamics and held executive global marketing roles at LinkedIn, Google, and Salesforce. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all in the panel. So the first question is about the importance of AI companies to plan to go global in Australia. And if you think it's important, what are the skills needed um, to expanding globally? Starting with you, Natalie.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me as part of the panel. It's very exciting to be walking amongst AI giants. So thank you for having me. So my perspective, having been with Google Cloud for the better part of this decade and working with startups and enterprises and internally with Google's teams, most recently with our next billion users team, looking at their strategy for scaling with AI. My perspective on this question is that planning to scale from the beginning would be my advice. Now, obviously, that comes with different caveats. But I think if you think about it from this lens, it would help you craft whether going AI makes sense for you and your business. So the first question I think you have to ask yourself is, are you solving a global AI problem? Firstly. So to give you an example of how we think about this in our Google X part of the business, which is, thinking about self-driving cars, thinking about decarbonising the electric grid and so on, they think about answering that question from these three lenses. The first is, are you solving a huge problem? For example, self-driving cars, people, are we going to save people's lives through having autonomous vehicles? The next part of that equation is it a breakthrough technology? And is there a radical solution to solve for? So I think that's the first question I think we need to ask ourselves. Are you solving a global AI problem? That's the first thing to think about. The second thing I think you need to think about is, where are your customers? And not just where are your customers, but where are your customers' customers? And we know that when you're solving with AI and ML, data is at the heart of everything you're doing. No data, no ML. So I think if you're thinking about going global and scaling globally, then you need to be thinking about where your customers are. And if you're solving a healthcare problem with AI in the US, you want to be thinking about HIPAA compliance, for example. And if you're thinking about scaling in the EU, then it's safe harbor and so on. So in terms of the skills, I really think you want to have some great kind of data AI lawyers as part of your emerging team. And then I guess finally, the final point is you really want to be, as a technologist, the first thing I think of is architecting for scale. And I think there's none of these things I'm saying necessarily cannot be undone. But as a technologist, I think most technologists would agree you want to be architecting for scale from the start, particularly with AI products, where you're not just designing for the solution that you have today, but you're designing for solutions that are going to hopefully collect more data in the future. And especially if you're collecting PII data, for example, and especially for selling to the enterprise, because they are going to ask you, where is the data stored? And in some cases, it has to be domiciled in that particular region that you're operating in. So architecting is your infrastructure in that region. And then, of course, there's trade-offs between architecting for cost and scale. So overall, I would say you want to be planning to go global from the start. Think about answering those three questions. Are you solving a global problem? Where are your customers? And are you architecting from scale for the start? So that's how I would look at it.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. I guess like as a data scientist, when my boss tells me we're going to go global first, it would scare the hell out of me. But Jeremy Howard, what do you think about it? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with some bits and disagree with some bits that Natalie was saying. I certainly agree Australian companies need to be looking global. I wouldn't use the word AI company actually. I think it's just, companies that happen to use AI is increasingly becoming most companies. And Australian companies are very well placed to leverage and benefit from AI. If you're more of that kind of data-driven online style of company, you don't have the same obstructions to global success that you do as if you were like shipping physical goods, right? So I think that's a very good kind of company to build in Australia. The place where I disagree is I would say don't plan for scale from the start. And the reason for that is that planning for scale it makes things a lot more complicated, and there's a pretty good chance that, well, I don't know about you, but for me, the first 10 things I try tend not to work. And so there's no point building those first 10 things, in a more complex, costly, engineering intensive way where we're building for scale, rather than I'd say really build an MVP. And often that means for an AI product, or a product that's supported by AI, that MVP will often be something that barely use AI at all, but kind of fakes it, and maybe it uses humans a lot more, and maybe initially it doesn't scale well at all. And then see if it works, see if people like it, and then figure out where the constraints are and focus on scaling those. So I'd suggest using more of a iterative approach, but I'd certainly say yes, Aussies should be looking to build global businesses from the start, because that's where the customers are.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Catriona, how do you think?
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, I'm between Nat and Jeremy. So my own experience in building an AI company was we didn't set up for scale or for global presence to start with. And we did exactly as Jeremy said, stuck it together with Band-Aids and made it into an MVP that then went really well. And then we had to go to the US, and then we had to scale in the US, and then we had to rebuild the whole thing from scratch whilst we had sold to clients who were expecting something to come in, and it was difficult and expensive to do. So it's very interesting, different strategies. I do believe that Australian-based organizations should be bold and be thinking about being global. I know in some of the startup vernacular, we talk about just do it in your own backyard and prove it in your own backyard. And then when you've done that, do the next step and do the next step. I don't believe that. I think build a bit of it here, and then as soon as possible, start to think about your global presence. But more when I think of the skills that my company needed in building our business in the US, it was almost less about the technology and more about how do you negotiate with a large corporate enterprise? How do you work your way through the procurement system? How do you adhere to their security requirements? So we ended up having to get SOC 2 Type 2 certification, which took us best part of a year and a half to build, and probably a couple of $1 million to have. No one told me about that on the early startup journey, that security would be so strong. So for me, there are other non-technical skills you need as a startup or a business person with AI to do well at a global level, which is around how do you engage with the organizations you're trying to sell to.
Thanks, Catriona. Yeah, of course, business skills are very important, especially for the global audience. And Jeremy Cooper, thank you very much for choosing Coop, because now I can just say Jeremy. um, what do you think about it?
I've got the benefit of going last, so I get to draft what my fellow panelists have said in some ways. I think that the simple truth is it's probably never been easier for Australian companies to go global. But I think that where it starts is that every company needs to start with an outward-looking focus. And that's just a very clear vision for where growth is going to come from, and to make sure that the company's codified the values by which it's going to make decisions against that vision. I think in terms of why Australian AI companies should go global, I think there are probably two main reasons. I think the first is it's obviously a very exciting time to be in tech, and the reality is you can't sustain a product roadmap, particularly an innovative product roadmap, unless you're attached to national self-interest solely on the back of the Australian market. And so you've got to be able to get diversified, market revenue streams and so on, in order to be able to access talent, build that roadmap, and fuel innovation. I think the second reason is really just what's happening with the economy globally. And I think particularly with AI, I think that we're going to look back, and it's going to be the lens which defines why today's leaders became tomorrow's followers. And whether it's across government, industry, or commerce, it's very clear that there is a major digital transformation that's starting to happen. And I think for Australian companies in particular, as innovative as they are, they need to get global for a variety of reasons, some of which I think the fellow panelists have described. But I think an important one that needs to be understood is that I think 2022 is probably going to be the year where regulation becomes a geopolitical tool. And that in certain markets, governments that are defining AI regulation, particularly under the banner of fairness, bias, and advantage, the companies in those jurisdictions will probably have an advantage over those that don't. And so I think getting present and getting out, I think, is important. I think the final thing that I'd close with, and again, not wanting to echo my fellow panelists, is I think a really important consideration for Australian companies isn't just the technology that they want to export. I think it also comes down to culture. And I remember many, many years ago, I was among the first handful of employees for Salesforce in Asia Pacific, and having a conversation with Mark Benioff in Tokyo, where he proposed the question, should we be Salesforce Japan or Salesforce in Japan? And I thought it was a really interesting question as to how companies should think about their presence, particularly those that are domiciled here within Australia. And I think that anybody that has an outward-looking vision is able to capture that with vision and values, has an eye to how they want to play on a global stage. I think it's a critically important ingredient that you're able to articulate the purpose and the culture of the company, because I think that's probably the only way that you're able to transmit with clarity and energy the conditions for success when going global.
Thanks, Coop. I guess we all agree that not only technical challenges we have to go global, but also we got some other challenges like business challenges. So Jeremy, giving your experience and going global with your companies before, what are some challenges in doing AI businesses globally, and any tips to overcome those? I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I don't think there's anything specific about AI companies there, but for building kind of online companies out of Australia, a lot of the challenges don't exist anymore. So when I started my email company, Fastmail, in 1999, I decided to make it global from the start. The number of reasons why. The first was, back in those days, Telstra's bandwidth pricing was, I can't remember, it's either 100 or 1,000 times higher. I think it's 1,000 times higher than in the US. And obviously, I expected most of my customers to be in America, so I wanted them to have a lower latency connection. This was in the days before there was really kind of the kind of Cloudflares and Fastly's of the world. And so I decided, to put my data center in New York, and just calling up Dell and IBM and trying to order a server and have it delivered to New York and pay for it on an Australian credit card. They didn't know how to do that. In those days, everything was hard. Honestly, nowadays, not much is hard at all, right? It's so easy to with any of the cloud providers, you can pick up a server basically in any jurisdiction you like, which means you can minimize your latency to the place where you expect to have the most customers. You can easily hire people all around the world, which means you can have real-time support available for your customers, in their own time zone. I will say actually one of the big challenges I had was, running an email company. You want to make sure everybody is, online all the time. And so when we did have a problem, it was nearly always at peak load, and that was during business hours in the US. So I very often was getting paged at 2 a.m. So I guess there is a challenge that as a founder, you have to be, kind of 24-hour on call, at least for the first few years. But from a technology point of view, I feel that things are, we're really well placed in Australia nowadays to run global businesses.
Thanks, Jeremy. Natalie, given you had so much experience partnering with companies that went global, what do you think? Do you want to add anything?
I feel like this almost leads into my answer into my next question. So maybe I think you answered that well. So maybe I'll wait till the next question.
Yeah, for sure. No worries, Catriona. For the same, would you like to add anything about the challenges AI companies have going global? I mean, you mentioned some of them about, the security.
Yeah, I would love to pick up, I think, on one of the Jeremy's cultural differences. So when we went to the US, which is maybe 5 years ago, we learned this saying about doing business with Americans, which is you pitch, and the person who you're pitching to is super enthusiastic and, yes, Catriona, this is great. This is the best technology ever. Yep, come back and have another meeting. Yep, really positive, positive, positive. So it's yes, 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 no. Whereas in Australia, it's no, 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 yes. So that was our great learning, that you don't get too, and I see a lot of startups coming back, Australian startups have come back from America and gone, went to that investor, that VC, and they were saying yes, yes, yes. And I went to that enterprise and they're saying yes, yes, yes. And I said, do not believe it until you've got something signed. Do not be raising money on the back of a yes, yes, yes from the US culture. It's so beautifully hospitable, but in the end, they could actually well say no.
That's a good one. I guess, understanding different cultures and making sure that you adapt. But anyway, if you want to raise on something that somebody says, yes, not a bad idea, you still have the money in your bank account. So you can figure out on later what to do. All right, for the next question, Natalie, how does the AI sector differ in Australia comparing to global markets? And what are the advantages we have in Australia?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've just spent the last 2 years in the UK, and I've seen some amazing advancements. I've been working in financial services in the financial fintech sector, and I would say, there is some incredible fintech revolution and AI happening in that space. But I think, really there's in Australia, we have such incredible, just by our surroundings and, the natural landscape in Australia. If you look in our backyard, we just had COP26 not long ago. So there's definitely been a really interesting conversation around climate change and so on. I mean, by nature of our land, we have so much sunlight. So there's so much opportunity for solar and wind. I think that's a really opportune space for us. On top of this, so last month, Google announced a $1 billion fund investment into the Australian ecosystem to look at supporting partnerships and infrastructure and innovation and so on. And one of the interesting problems they've put funding towards is figuring out how we can use AI technology to support the Great Barrier Reef. And if you're aware of course, the perils that are happening to our natural ecosystem in the Great Barrier Reef, crown of thorns, the starfish, is actually one of the things that is destroying the reef. And Google just announced a partnership with Kaggle and the CSIRO to figure out how we can build an AI algorithm to look at identifying and tracking those starfish. And, it's like, oh, cool, Google gave some money. Oh, that's cool. But what it actually means is that we've opened up the opportunity for local businesses and AI leaders to be able to actually build in that space. And of course, coming back to my earlier point around, the natural ecosystem that we have to be able to solve for. And I think, my final point, just thinking on the spot here, is that I think, people often say in Australia we're risk averse. I fundamentally do not believe that is true. I think with our culture, oftentimes we're scared of failure, and I think that's actually very different. So I think, we've got all the right ingredients, be it our technology, be it the physical landscape that we have to be able, and the Australian attitude to get it done is my perspective.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Natalie. Coop, would you please let us know if you know any of the advantages we have here in Australia in comparison with the global, market?
I've just returned to Australia after being away for 22 years. So there are probably some other panelists that are more intimately familiar with some of the advantages we have. What I do detect is, there's an AI action plan. There's a progressive government that probably needs to weigh in with more investment. But I think that the advantage we have is also the disadvantage, which is we have a great degree of willingness amongst Australian companies that believe AI is very or critically important to their success. I think there was a survey recently done by Deloitte that suggested it was as much as 2/3 of Australian companies believe that. But conversely, I think access to talent is a key issue within the country, and so I think we've got to work out how do we take what seems to be the willingness of government to invest, the desire of Australian companies to take full advantage of AI, but then very quickly translate that into a set of policies and programs that fill in the talent access gap that seems to be present in the country.
Thanks, Coop. I would like to get back to you, Natalie, about cloud computing, which is an enabler for AI companies. So starting with you, what's Google doing to support businesses in this area?
Yeah. I think, Jeremy Howard summed it up really, really well in that the barrier to entry to building and the risk to try something and fail is the lowest that it has ever been, ever in time. So, of course, pretty much there has been no conversation that I've been in lately in a boardroom or with a startup, a large enterprise where cloud is not part of the conversation. It is at the center of every single conversation that I'm in with leaders across Australia. And that's for obviously a few different reasons. First, I think particularly with startups is it's managed services. So like you were saying, Jeremy, you go out and buy the servers. You definitely didn't want to be the person that brought too much. It was left sitting idle, or the person that didn't buy enough and you're spiking and you don't have enough capacity. So managed services are key. So to give you an example, Snapchat was, of course, most of us in the room would know the social media platform that scaled using, managed services like App Engine and Data Store, where you have your application and you throw as many users as you wanted it and data as you wanted it, and the infrastructure scales up and down depending on the scale or the demand on that application. So that's managed services in the application space or the infrastructure space. And then again, really low barrier to entry around data and AI tools. So if you look at most cloud computing platforms, you'll have a spectrum of AI. So on one end, it's TensorFlow, and you create your own models. On the other end, kind of predefined packaged AIs like vision and speech to text. and sentiment analysis and so on, that you don't have to be a data expert or an ML expert to use. Data citizens are the fastest growing users of data and AI in the world at the moment. And so again, you don't have to have this deep expertise to maybe in the long term to build something into production. That's a different story, but just to test and try an idea, there's no better time to do that now with managed services. And then I guess to your point around what else is Google doing, I think, there was some interesting commentary earlier today. I think we have some students, professor of students in the room who are working at DeepMind. So DeepMind's Google's research hub, which is working on some of the most complex AI problems in the world, most recently with AlphaFold. So, the way the human body is made up, there's little engines inside our bodies that are proteins that are essentially the basis of how our bodies are made. And, there's more than 200 million proteins in the body, and we've actually only mapped like the tiniest bit of them. But Google has just released a paper on predicting the structure and the fold of every protein in the body. So then you look at that and you say, wow, what can we do with that around personalized medicine, or looking at enzymes and how can we extract microplastics from the ocean? Like, the opportunities are limitless. And then I think the final thing, just to make sure, I'm giving you a balanced view here, is that, sometimes things fail, like with Google X, and oftentimes they do. Makani is a good example of that, where we looked at using wind turbines, like kites, essentially, put them in the sky and fly them offshore to capture the wind naturally, instead of big infrastructure of wind turbines and so on. And it failed. There was no path to market, and that's okay, because innovation's like running a relay race. Sometimes you just have to pass the baton. And in that case, we did. And then Google launched around 400 or so patents and non-assertion pledges, which means that, other folks don't have to learn the hard way sometimes, where they don't have the resources and time that perhaps, Google X would have, but they can learn from those mistakes too when things don't go right. So I think that's an important part to mention too.
Yeah, for sure. I can vouch for that. I was a panelist a couple of months ago in an internal event at Google with Google Brain and Google Mind people, and they were talking about amazing projects rolling out very soon. For Jeremy Howard, one of their projects was about, I don't know, it slips out of their conversations, but was AGI in 10 years for Google. So let's see what happens in there. But back to you, Catriona, what are the supports out there in Australia for AI companies to go global?
Soon there will be more support with the government. So in the last federal election, the government gave $124 million to Australian AI. $54 million of that is going to build the National AI Centre, which I'm hoping will be announced in the next month. And the mandate for the centre is to be the centre of the ecosystem, supporting Australian companies raise their AI levels, adoption, and then also supporting organisations going overseas. So I think there is, in theory, the federal government will be supporting. Otherwise, there's certainly starting to be more services such as Artesian Capital and Boab AI, what we do. We are at the moment the only dedicated AI scale-up program backed by a fund, Artesian in our case, and Victorian government. And we're super keen that our portfolio companies, a number of whom are in the room today, do what they need to do here and then help scale them globally. So definitely some of the investment companies will support them. But otherwise, when I took my company global, which was 5 years ago, there was not a lot of help and it was tough and it was expensive. But I do believe, such as Coop said now, the processes are in place to do it. And a number of our portfolio companies are already servicing multiple nations. So I think it is easier now. And again, I will always say GD1, global from day one. that's what everyone should think.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Catriona. And the final thoughts from Jeremy Howard. Do you believe that we have enough support here in Australia, and since you had success going global, have you got enough support, and what would you like to see more?
No, there's not nearly enough support. It's for and I'm focusing particularly on startups, which nowadays about half of startups have some AI foundation behind them, and in Australia, BOAB's one of the very few, if not the only, kind of AI focused investment funds, and it's really really important that an investment fund is AI focused, because you don't want to be talking to a partner. You're trying to convince them to invest in your technology, and they don't understand the technology, and so in Australia there's far too much investment in kind of less bold, aiming low, local stuff, because there's a lack of support for highly technical entrepreneurs doing genuinely groundbreaking things. And it's not just in investment, the same is true in academia as well. There's not enough folks in academia in Australia who are really on top of the latest technologies. I mean, there are, but they're the young folks just doing their PhDs, not the previous generation. This is really different to what I found in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where the vast majority of investors I spoke to were right on top of the detailed technology situation. There was lots of people being hired into senior academic positions who were in their late 20s or early 30s, who really were on top of the modern AI approaches. So I feel like in Australia we've really got to up our game and particularly modernize it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Now we're going to open it up for our audience and also our live audience to ask the questions. Feel free to put your questions in the comments. And if you have any questions, would you like to ask our awesome panelists? I'm happy to take. All right. Yes.
Steve, if you could repeat the question, that would be great.
Right. Sorry. No, that's right.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Coop. Yeah, so the question was, I was hoping you could elaborate on the thought that you shared where you said that regulation of AI was likely to become a geopolitical and strategic tool. Some examples of where you've seen that happening and where you see that going.
Great, thanks for the question. I mean, I think I feel it more as an emerging tension. I think in lots of ways, AI, isn't entirely regulated, but it's clearly a tool at multiple levels, particularly sovereign levels in markets like China. The US has ambitions, as do others. And I think the market or the country that is the most effective over the next 12 to 24 months at being able to create some level of global standards for the companies in those jurisdictions, it's undeniable, given the size of some of those jurisdictions, that they'll have an advantage over organizations that aren't within those. My concern is that, well, it's not a concern, it's more of an observation, is that there's already a rising level of discussion around things like, bias, fairness, and a number of other areas at a commercial level. So prior to returning to Australia, I ran marketing for a division within LinkedIn for many years. And some of the questions that we were really wrestling with, particularly over the last 12 to 24 months, was, how unconscious bias could creep into a search algorithm. And that's at a pretty basic level, but it's emotive and it's emotional, and so it gives rise to the opportunity for governments to be able to regulate. I think similarly, sovereignty is going to become a key issue. I think Natalie spoke a little bit about data sovereignty. But I think the way that AI gets leveraged in certain countries, particularly at the national interest level, also creates the circumstances for a more pronounced regulatory environment that has implications both on the government sector but also on the commercial sector.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question's for both Natalie and Jeremy, and it's more around, I know Natalie was talking about your involvement in research and the work that DeepMind's doing, and Jeremy, I know you're a professor. Where do you think the place of research in Australia comes, and how do you find that our industries like Google can work more closely with researchers? Is that something that you're building into your models?
Yeah, so I think the $1 billion fund that was just announced last month there is a key part of that, kind of 3 or 4 pillars, is partnership. So, for example, I mentioned one of the key partnerships currently is with the CSIRO, but it's not limited to that. But it is one example of where we're looking at the Crown of Thorns research with Kaggle. But absolutely, there's never a limit to the ability or the need rather for us to partner with research and educational institutions. I mean, that is the birthplace of a lot of our best ideas in Australia. You really don't have to look too far than look at our universities to see that. But then, of course, sometimes those research need the might or need the commercialization skills and so on, or they have the big backing and the might of the broader Alphabet group. That I've seen before, whether it's health, it's a health AI algorithm around dementia, for example, or epilepsy, where I've recently seen that some research partner with our Google Fitbit team, which has just been launched in Australia, where they say, how can we use a watch that now has a medical grade, hospital grade ECG scanner to then detect when an individual might go into an epileptic fit. I mean, that needs the might of both a university that has the research, but then, for example, like a Google that has the might of the hardware business behind it. So I think no better example of the commitment in terms of the $1 billion fund and the CSIRO, but, there's definitely more that we can do. And we have dedicated, government and university teams in Australia that this is their role to do this, day in and day out, is to look for these partnerships for us to continue to work together with local businesses. So great question. And it's one of the 4 or 5 pillars of this fund that's just been announced.
It's actually a big difference I've seen between the US, particularly San Francisco Bay Area, and Australia. I've spent the last 9 years there. And I was at a University of San Francisco, and I worked very closely with Google and Facebook AI research and Amazon, and Salesforce. There was a huge amount of collaboration between the Bay Area universities and the big tech companies. And it was great for both sides, the universities were really ensuring they were working on practical cutting edge stuff because they were working with the companies that were doing practical cutting edge stuff, and the big tech companies had access to the top researchers. And that does not happen in Australia, unfortunately. And, I am quite hopeful with, as Natalie said, there will be an investment in Google research in Australia, and that's going to be pretty much the first time, I think, that there's been a big tech company
it is.
bringing research here. And I hope that inspires all your competitors to do the same thing, and I hope that Australian universities really engage with them, because that is an area that Australian universities are really lacking at the moment, is those kind of deep technical collaborations.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. Yeah, as part of the $1 billion fund, it was announced that there's a research arm of Google being built. So yes.
Exciting. Any more questions? You can even ask about the existential threat. Yes, Adrian.
I could ask about the existential threat. I think the singularity probably will eventually happen, but when it comes, we'll be living with AI. So I'm not sure which panelist to ask. Natalie, I think you made a reference that, Australians have got a culture of being quite good at coming up, with new ideas. And Kat, I think you made some reference to this as well. And then Jeremy, you were sort of reflecting on what it's like in San Francisco. I actually think for some of our students, the PhD students, we have to encourage them to be a bit more ambitious sometimes. And also sometimes in industry at the moment, as we're hearing, advances in AI are as much happening in industry at the moment as they are in universities. There's no denial about that. In some sense, it's hard to keep up. And so I guess the question is, how do we encourage our entrepreneurs to be ambitious enough and to really take a stab at, is that a problem? For us, it's a bit of a problem. Sometimes the researchers want to do incremental research and we have to encourage them to think bigger. It's also being able to see what value is, because sometimes value is different from research. It's what is business value, for example.
Yeah, so I'm keen to respond to that. So I did an article for the AFR a couple of weeks ago on innovation, and I was researching the Global Innovation Index, which puts Australia at number 24, 56 of the top income earning countries in the world. So we like average. And we had a reasonably high level of investment into research for innovation and a very poor performance in technology output or commercialization. So there's a gap that happens, which I think is exactly what you're saying, between we do the research, there's some smart ideas, but the commercialization of that is very difficult. I sit on the board of the Garvan Institute, so Australia's largest medical research institute, 700 researchers, and we're just grappling with how do we start to commercialize medical research and how do we build data science and AI into this massive organization. So I still feel my kind of just general view, also similar to the Jeremy's, having spent quite a lot of time in the US, is Australians, we're just risk averse. We really are. There's also never been a burning platform. We didn't really have a global financial crisis. The pandemic has been difficult, particularly difficult here in Melbourne, but not like other countries who were really, really rocked by it. We don't have a burning platform. We sit around pretty happy and comfortable, but the other side of that is a lack of impetus to take risk and be bold. So 100%. And I hope that the work that we're doing at BOAB in partnership with the universities, we can start to kind of mash up our entrepreneurial mindsets with your super brainy students.
Can I just add something to that, because I think this is just such an incredibly important question and such an incredibly important point. It's like, it's a vast cultural chasm between the, hugely successful startup generation factory in, California versus us that has, 0.39% of AI investment in the world here in Australia. You really see the cultural difference writ large, particularly going there and then coming back. I come back and I'm just overwhelmed by how small people are thinking, but actually most of the people, so I've interviewed lots and lots of students, PhD students and academics since I've got back, and the vast majority of the time I found it was the students who wanted to think bigger and the academics that were encouraging their students to think smaller. So it's great to hear that and I'm sure it's not universal, and I don't doubt that for a moment, but I do, if I was picking one area to focus on, I'd be focusing on the academics and encouraging them to be at least less discouraging when their students want to do something that is A, very current, and B, potentially highly impactful, even if there's some risk that it might not be successful.
Yeah, Jeremy, if I can just add to that, and just building on Catriona's comments, I think one of the defining features of Silicon Valley is the ability to fail forward. And it's interesting to me how many successful entrepreneurs have had several failures on the way. And so if you step back and try and understand why that is, I just think it's a very fertile coexistence between venture capital dollars, academia, and then the large IT companies. and the small ones, all of whom think that they can change the world, which is what makes it a pretty special place. But I think to your point, Catriona, I think there's being risk averse, but there's also a climate or an environment that encourages people to fail forward and to make sure that the conditions are right for that, whether that be the access to the next round of funding for the next great idea, whether it be access to talent, and then the coexistence in terms of where that talent gets incubated and comes into the market.
Yeah, I'd love just to pick up on that, Kip, because I play a role at BOAB where some of the portfolio companies, can you put your hand up here if you're a portfolio company in BOAB? Okay, a few of them. So because I was one of the first AI entrepreneurs in Australia, made so many mistakes, so, failed, like we were really successful until we weren't. But I learned so much in that most of my coaching of these guys is what not to do. It's like, okay, don't go with that partner, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, because when we did it, we failed at it. So there is that's not normally how we're encouraged to be as coaches here. It's like, we teach you how to be successful. It's very important. 2/3 of running a startup is managing the risk of failure. It's not about just focusing on success. So my many epic fails are particularly useful to these guys in the room.
That's great. All right, guys, I think that's a wrap. And thank you very much, Natalie, Catriona, Jeremy Howard, and Jeremy Cooper for joining us. I loved the conversation. I learned a lot from it, having a couple of different experience in startups and public and private sector. I know that's going to be a gem for all our audience and also our live audience. So please take some 10 minutes to enjoy the refreshments and come back for our next event, which is a pitch. Some of our great AI scale-ups going to join us for a competition, and we will find the winners soon. Thank you.